couple of things I want to address before this video starts fully is, as you can probably tell, my voice is kind of terrible. I was at the Ohio State Texas game and I lost a good bit of my voice. Second of all, I am presenting a video that, even though I'm presenting a lot of points that I agree with, I wouldn't say I wholeheartedly agree with. These are not my total endorsements. I feel like this video took a good bit of research, but part of the other, part of the equation is that do I initially subscribe to these ideologies wholeheartedly? That's still in the process. I'm still working out my personal opinions. And then lastly, I know I only said 2 points, but lastly, I'm borrowing a lot of philosophy and ideology from Ron Paul, who is kind of the modern, hero of libertarianism, former congressman, former presidential candidate, a trailblazer in my opinion, and one of the few people alive who still represent, in my opinion, what the founding fathers actually intended for. Okay, with that all to the side, I'm going to make my take on this idea of ending the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the independent agency that is responsible for making, interest rates, printing money, and all that good stuff. Why are they so bad? Obviously, I will start off by saying I don't think the people who make up the Federal Reserve, especially Chairman Powell, are malicious people. I just think that the Federal Reserve as an agency, as an institution, the infrastructure is not only unconstitutional but unethical. And this video seeks to answer that from, I guess, a Gen Z perspective. But first of all, my first point, and I would say my strongest point, is that the Federal Reserve is inherently unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress has the ability to print and coin money as well as regulate the value thereof. And that's a very explicit power. There's this concept in constitutional law called the non-delegation doctrine, which essentially says that no branch of government is allowed to give up their power to someone else. And that totally makes sense, right? Why would the founding fathers put into pen and paper these explicit powers for our branches of government just for them to give away their powers? And so for those of you who don't know, the Federal Reserve was just basically an act of that, giving away congressional power. And that was because of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which I have here. It says outsource the power to a cartel of private bankers. There's been so many instances where the Federal Reserve has been closely connected with bankers. More on that a little later. And here's my most important part, this idea of democratic accountability, right? I had a great discussion with one of my friends who is a very pro Federal Reserve guy. This idea that we ought to have an economic agency that is unaffiliated with politics. But there's a very famous saying that it's all politics. Everything's politics. His strongest point, and I'd say it is valid, right? Why would you want a Congress? Why would you want your congressman, running the Federal Reserve? Like, that is just so crazy to think about, because all these congressmen would say, hey, vote for me for lower interest rates, yada, 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 right? And while I will contest that is not necessarily the most positive thing, that is at least a shred of bit better than what we currently have. Sure, vote for your congressman who's telling you we're going to lower the interest rate, but by that same token, an interest rate that is lowered forever is going to result in an unstable economy, and therefore, what do you get to do as an American citizen? You get to vote your congressman out of power. How about that? We have a Federal Reserve, an independent agency that gets to do these landmark, huge changes about our government, but we don't get to have a say. Thomas Paine, no, it wasn't Thomas Paine. I forgot who else, but the founding father who said no taxation without representation would be, kicking in his grave right now if he heard about what the Federal Reserve did. Of course you're going to say, well, the Federal Reserve doesn't collect taxes. Well, they're responsible for things like inflation policy, which Ron Paul likes to claim and likes to argue is a hidden tax. Anywho, my second point is that the Federal Reserve, when they set their interest rates by a committee, it is very like almost this Soviet style central planning and finance, right? I understand, You want this idea of the smartest, most apolitical, nonpartisan people to set the standard. But the infrastructure that be, you've seen a president, and this is why it's topical today. You've seen a president trying to dip his hand into the Federal Reserve, and we don't know what the law is because we haven't envisioned this, right? We haven't the infrastructure hasn't been tested. So I'm arguing at this from a systematic issue. I'm not saying that Powell's a bad person. I'm not saying the people in the Federal Reserve are capable of making, that all they do is make bad decisions and they're all stupid. I'm not talking about the people. It's more so the institution that is. Um, Another point that Ron Paul likes to bring up is this idea of if you hold your rates artificially low, the Federal Reserve can encourage reckless borrowing, right? And was most apparent during 2008, as well as the dot-com bubble of 2000. I want to make this video as quick as possible, so I'll just hit on all the points. Another point is what Ron Paul likes to bring up is these bailouts. Banks and corporations know, and this was most apparent in 2008, and even the COVID response, that there's a such thing as too big to fail. These banks can take these outlandish risks because they know that they will be bailed out. They will pocket the profits and socialize the losses, and ultimately it gets passed on to the taxpayer. But I have so many points, but I don't want to make this video too long, and I don't want to make my voice too mute by the time I have to get back to class in a couple days. But why is this so important today? Other than the fact that I did bring up Donald Trump, tampering with the infrastructure that is, a lot of gray area here. We're coming to a point economically that our traditional indicators, job growth, GDP, inflation, they can no longer suffice. And I think this was most apparent just almost a year ago with the 2024 election. All of these predictors, all these people who, faithfully, almost religiously, had faith in these economic indicators to prove and to predict who would become the next president, all failed miserably. This was the first time in a while that your economic indicators did not accurately prove a president. And this was not a close Bush v. Gore type of situation. This was a handed, consolidated win for Donald Trump. And so, what goes to show here is that we are entering a scary time in our economy. You might not feel it now, but you will feel it eventually. The debt is piling up. Interest rates are hazy. Things of that nature. Inflation is always a big question mark. Things like tariff policies, what can a president can or can't do? All of these things are starting to crumble together, and it's like this huge, magnificent fuckfest of a symphony almost to show the hundreds of years that has happened in our government. The Congress removing its own powers, the president, gaining more authority. Our economy is more globalized than ever. So this idea of foreign affairs can be almost, any topic, any circumstance fits under this idea of foreign affairs. Therefore, giving the president much more control. You're seeing the Supreme Court giving itself much more control and much more freedom to choose and decide on landmark policy. I'll pause for a little bit, but in total, I'm not trying to freak anybody out. I'm not trying to, this is not DEFCON 3. I'm just saying, essentially, that we have entered a new frontier in politics where all the shit, all the baggage, this essential kicking the can down the road has consequences. And for better or for worse, it is catching up. And, I guess don't say I didn't warn you. If this doesn't happen, if we all just, march along in happiness and nothing is wrong, and the next president will come in, no matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat, and everything will be fine, I will admit defeat, candidly. But I think there is genuine concern to be had. And I think, picking up Ron Paul's book, End the Fed, or just tuning into his podcast, would give you good insight to this ideology. I'm not saying you have to be a libertarian. I'm not saying you have to think that, you know, there should be no such thing as gun policy or gun control. Even within the libertarian movement, there are people who have their own ideas and their own ways. I've even heard of socialist libertarians. So it's a wide variety, just like any other ideology. But um, yeah, I've been ranting on for way too long. This video could be longer, but I just wanted to hit on the big points. But thank you for watching. If you like the video, like the video. If you dislike the video, dislike it. And I am out.